He threatened me in the lab. I locked him inside with the virus he created. I say it plain because that is the version people lean toward when stories come out fractured and hungry for spectacle. The blunt sentence that fits on a thumbnail, that will be talked about at barbershops and at church. The truth is more a line of steady choices. The truth is that when a danger stares at you and smiles like it owns the world, your first job is to keep the people you love from being in its way. I was 10 minutes late to the hospital because I couldn't find a clean pair of shoes that matched feeling brave. The city was already wet, the sky the color of dishwater, and the van's heater kept coughing. I remember the steering wheel smelling like old leather and the coffee thermos I should have filled but didn't. Vada, she's small, fierce in a way that surprises you, was on a ventilator. Dr. Dubois stood with his face half bent toward the monitor, his lips moving as if he were checking the math of life. "You came," Vada mouthed when she finally blinked and tried to smile. Her voice was a stripped thing, a wire tugged too tight. "Don't let him in." Those two words, soft and urgent, took the air out of me. They landed where something heavy already was waiting. I had funded that lab. I had signed checks for the equipment, the safer hood that hums like a trapped bee, the research stipend that paid for Vada's schooling, the van Sterling drove when he got too cocky for his own good. I had sent money when Sterling's promises soured into appetite, promises about paying back, about being sensible, about not gambling away the grants I had saved for Vada's apprenticeship. I had been the person who believed in second chances and called them investments. I had been wrong. If this story needed a hero, I was not going to play one on instinct. I had learned over a long life how tenderness and rage can be two sides of the same hand. You can hold a teacup and a hammer at once. I folded into that hand now, and the hammer was steady. Before I go on, a small ask. If this story hits something in you, if you want to see more people who survive told honestly, consider subscribing. It helps get stories like this out where they might do some good. I will tell you how we came here. People liked Sterling at first. He had that easy laugh that made other people's shoulders drop. He could charm a funder with a stale joke and the right inflection. He called himself a scientist, and in the beginning he was bright, quick, working nights to make up for his rough schooling. Vada had been his mentor, then his friend, then something messier when she thought love could be the form that balanced him. I remember the night I drove down to the lab and found him asleep in a folding chair, his head on a stack of grant proposals, and the faint smell of bleach on his collar. He looked like a worker then, not a predator. I bought him that first car because he needed to be on time, and because I wanted him to feel like a grown man. I am old enough to say when generosity becomes enabling. The first lie was a small one. He told me the grant would come through any day. He told me the university would match. He told me that the new incubator was essential and that he would pay me back by Christmas. I believed him, because you want to believe your child is not a swindler. The second lie got teeth fast. Forged signatures on compliance documents. A check made out to equipment that had been funneled into a private account. A van with the lab's logo that he registered in his name and sold for cash. Somebody else noticed the missing PPE when a shipment never arrived, and a junior tech told a supervisor that Sterling had been shorting the inventory to pay off his debts. Little things, each like a stone thrown into calm water, the circle spread until the whole surface was brittle. When Veda collapsed that afternoon, it was not cinematic. She had been telling me for weeks about headaches that went from dull to screaming, about days where the back of her neck burned, about a supervisor who told her to sit down and keep going. On the night before she went under, she messaged me a picture of an old notebook, a photo of a page with memes and times, and a sentence that was underlined twice. Safety checks skipped, Sterling certified. She had highlighted a list of chemicals that were supposed to be locked in inventory, but were missing. I drove to the lab because my daughter's note made a path straight to my feet. The lab smelled like cold tin and lemon cleaner when I stepped inside. Fluorescent lights made everything small and clinical. There were sheets over benches and the hum of refrigerators. It should have been tidy. It wasn't. I saw a stack of unpaid invoices on the receptionist's desk, the supplier's calls logged and unanswered. There was a ledger where entries had been crossed out and scribbled over, and there, in a battered mason jar, was a set of keys with a tag that read van. I called Officer Bradshaw from the parking lot because the van had been reported stolen. By a university, by a funder, by me, in a call I made 2 nights ago. Sterling had kept it. He had pledged the van as collateral to a bookie. When Veda's eyes met mine the first time, before she spoke those 2 words, I saw something that made the edges of my mind go quiet. She was not simply ill. She looked like someone whose trust had been structurally undermined. There is a look people get when their life has been hollowed out by someone they loved. You might call it betrayal carved into skin. It is not possible to fix that with a pill. Dr. Dubois closed his chart and told me the technical things a doctor must tell. Dehydration, encephalopathy, the markers that suggested prolonged exposure and neglect. He did it with the same professional calm he used when he told me my mother was in a heart failure 5 years back. He did not point fingers. The finger that pointed was my own memory. How did this happen? I asked him, not because I wanted medical jargon, but because the question needed an answer I could use. It could be environmental exposure, he said. It could be pre-existing conditions exacerbated by stress and lack of care. We need tests, monitors. Right now, we stabilize. I watched the beeps of the monitor and thought of grant checks, of bank statements, of the smell of the van's leather. Some questions take you straight to paperwork. Some questions take you to court. Some take you to the front door and to the people who hold keys. Odora answered on the second ring. She is an attorney who is as blunt as a cast-iron pan and twice as reliable. I have known her since she represented a cousin in a probate fight years ago. She understands how institutions move, and she moves faster. When I told her about the notebook photo and about the unpaid invoices and about Vada's 2 words, "Don't let him in," Odora stopped being a friend and became a strategy. "We do not play with rumors," she said. "We build a case." It takes a certain kind of cruelty to take a child's frail life and try to move your hands through it for profit. Sterling was that kind of cruel by degrees. He eroded safety like a slow mold. He missed renewal certificates. He labeled checks as equipment when they were bailouts. He laughed when the lab manager called him about an expired permit. He told Vada to drink water and keep working. He told me he would fix it. Nice lines all, until the ledger and the notebook in the hospital told another story. We set traps the honest way. We called biosafety officers. We called the university's general counsel. We filed inventory reports and turned over bank statements. We notified the funding agency that there were discrepancies. We made sure every step was recorded. There is a way to be surgical with paperwork, and I have learned it takes less romance and more receipts. Odora wrote the emergency letters that made administrators sit up in their chairs and stop being polite. She demanded an immediate freeze on lab access. She asked for an audit. The campus's biosafety officer, an anxious man with a fondness for tab collars, came in the morning clutching a clipboard and laconic apologies. He smelled like printer ink and fear. "Under the emergency provisions," he said, reading from a policy I couldn't have quoted, "we can suspend access and place the facility under lockdown until hazards are assessed. We will need to disable badges, change locks, and secure any hazardous materials." He used the word "we" like it was a shield. I watched Sterling manage his entitlement as if it were a muscle. He had that look, the look of someone who believes rules apply to other people. He had his fists on the lab door, his badge still lit but failing. He came back that afternoon like he owned the hallway. He wanted his things, his credentials, his car, his respect. He wanted to be let in, to show how wrong we all were. "You're overreacting," he told me, voice too loud for the sterile corridor. He had the rasp I remembered from the first time he smoked a cigar as a joke outside a fundraiser, the laugh that scraped like dry glass. "You don't get to take my life. I built this." I thought of the mason jar of keys. I thought of the notebook with an underlined sentence. I thought of Vada's breath, sounding like a small engine. My mouth tasted like metal. "You do not get to take her life," I said. I did not shout. You learn, with age, that shouting rings hollow in hospital corridors. I am not a priest of spectacle. I am a woman who has been patient for too long. He stepped closer, threat in the set of his jaw. He leaned toward me like he wanted to tilt my chin and check if I belonged to him. He had a way of talking over someone, a way of making their name into an echo of his own pride. "You gave everything, and what did you get? A mess, a thankless job." It is remarkable how entitlement makes a man's voice smaller and meaner when the consequences arrive. He tried to press a hand to the glass that separated Vada's room from the corridor. I moved so his hand could not reach the pane. Another woman with a clipboard, one of Vada's colleagues, sauntered up and said nothing, only looked at him like a person who had been keeping a ledger of slights ready to balance. "This is not related to you," the biosafety officer said, suddenly stiffer. "Your access has been suspended pending an investigation." For a moment, Sterling's face became a map. Then he pulled out a crumpled sheet of paper and waved it like a flag. "You can't do that. This isn't legal. I have contracts. I have signatures." That paper was a set of authorization forms he had pasted together from different sources. Odora had already seen what he thought he'd concealed. She had gone to the bank where a recent withdrawal had moved money into an account with his name on it. She had called the funder who had been promised a matching amount. She had driven down to the dealership that sold him the car and asked the manager to hold all titles. She had done paperwork like a surgeon and stitched the hospital to her side. "You forged a signature, Sterling," she said later, when she arrived and set her briefcase down like a weapon. Odora had a look about her then, a slow, iced patience that made the room colder. "You misallocated funds. You interfered with safety protocols. You left someone vulnerable. Do you understand what happens when you're careless with other people's lives?" Sterling's mouth opened, then closed. For once, his charm misfired. He had not expected the legal machinery to arrive so promptly. He had imagined the universe being generous because he persisted. He had not accounted for the fact that the person he had harmed had a mother who would convert generosity into defense. There are measures you take with locks and badges that are not secrets. You disable electronic access, you inventory equipment, you seal storage. But there are also measures that are about money and control. We filed an emergency petition to reassign grant oversight to the institution's trust until a full audit could be completed. That meant that the checks that had been written to equipment would be rerouted to a restricted account for Veda's care. It meant that the van's registration that had been transferred to his name was frozen pending investigation. It meant that the lab's petty cash was inspected and that any missing items were noted and reported to the funding agency. We did this with forms and signatures and the kind of relentless patience only old women possess. Sterling tried to use the language of the street, shouting that what we were doing was theft, that we were stealing his future. He wailed that institutions would chew him up. He threatened me in the corridor, a sentence said with the same flint of someone who confuses volume with consequence. "You think you can take everything?" he spat. "You think this is over?" It is easy when a man threatens you to let fear decide what you will do next. I was not afraid of Sterling's hands. I was afraid of what his hands had done and might yet do if left to run. I thought of Veda's breath, of that notebook with the double underlined sentence. I thought of the smell of lemon cleaner and the sound of the ventilator steadying her small chest. A threat in a hospital corridor is an ugly performance unless you follow it up with something stronger than words. So I lodged an official complaint with Officer Bradshaw. I told him about the van, about the ledger, about the notarized forms that didn't match. He took notes like someone planting flags. He looked at Sterling and read him the possibility of arrest if he interfered with hospital operations or threatened staff. Sterling mocked the officer at first, then his voice lowered as he worked the math in his head. Threats are a currency that lose value when verified in sworn reports. The lockdown itself was an act handled by people with badges and keys I could not imitate. The university's facilities crew sent 2 contractors and a locksmith. Their job was mechanical and blunt. Change the locks, remove key fobs, post notices. The biosafety officer called the federal hotline for reportable incidents, because there was an obligation when research might pose a risk. I will not tell you the phone number they called, because that is not the point. The point is that professionals acted, and when professionals act, the spectacle of a threat shrinks. I stood in the corridor as a red light blinked above the lab door, security lockdown, the sign read, and felt the long, slow arithmetic of decisions.
A woman came up the hall with a stack of folders and the small, tight smile of someone who has lived through many betrayals. "We will secure the inventory," she said. "We will document everything. We will make sure the funds go where they were intended." Sterling's threats began to sound like a child beating on a door that would not open. He fingered his badge like an old prayer bead, and at one point tried to throw the badge smack of entitlement back at the biosafety officer. "You can't do this to me," he said. "You don't understand the implications." We do understand implications. We understand that the ripple from one bad decision can take a life. We understand that a lab that is cornered by someone's greed can become a place where small mistakes make monsters. We understand that legal and institutional measures are not theater. They are fences that keep people alive. When the locksmiths came, it was an odd little theater. The cut of tools, the smell of metal filings, the clack of new pins being fitted into something old. We did not joke about it. We watched and took notes. The contractors rekeyed doors, changed master locks, and took inventory tags. A security team installed a temporary shield in the hallway. When the badges failed, Sterling's face went pale in a way that had nothing to do with the fluorescence. He tried to bully the supervisor in the hallway, calling him names, misquoting policies, making the kind of accusation that is intended to intimidate. Odora, who had been working the phone line, filed an emergency administrative order that the institution accepted on the basis of the evidence we had already provided. It was legal armor, wrapped in acronyms and signatures. It was not pretty, it was precise. "You're moving money?" He barked at me once, as if finances were an intimacy he still had a right to. "You're changing titles? You have no right." I remembered the mornings I had sat with him and given him envelopes like remedy. I remembered arguing with my sister about whether to keep giving to a man who spent the family savings at 3 a.m. at dice tables. I remembered the feeling of watching a child step into a path he could not see. I did not say the things that would have made him cry. I said what needed to be said. "This was not vengeance," I said, a phrase I would carry with me like a clean shirt. This was an eviction of a danger. People like to split the world into punishers and saints, into Mother Courage and villain. But life is not a play. It is choices. There are degrees of cruelty and degrees of mercy, and often they share a bedside. I made my choices in the sterile light of the hospital corridor, with a ventilator ticking like a metronome, and a notebook that had been photocopied and filed away. There were small public moments that had consequence. Candy, Queen Candy to the younger staff, brought coffee to Veda's room one morning and took a picture of the sign on the lab door.
She posted it with a caption that did not name names, but that set the rumor mill moving. Candy is a social exposure agent without a license. She amplifies things that need amplification. I did not ask her to post anything, but the picture did what pictures do. It made other people look. Sterling tried to go to social media to fight back. He posted videos of himself, half arguing, half pleading, with captions that made him sound like the aggrieved party. He called administrators corrupt. He called me controlling. He put his face up like a pleading mask, but the ledger did not blink, and the pictures of missing inventory did not care about a good angle. Meanwhile, Vada remained in the hospital, and our momentum shifted to what mattered most, her recovery. The institutional lockout of the lab meant that funding could no longer be accessed by a man whose decisions had risked lives. Odora persuaded the funding agency to release interim aid for medical expenses pending the audit. We moved to set up a care fund in Vada's name. We contacted the postdoctoral program director and offered Vada a position that would be contingent on her recovery and on protective oversight. It was the kind of small, bureaucratic kindness that helps people stand up again. I visited Vada as much as the beeping schedule allowed. I would sit in the chair next to her bed and tell her stories of the neighborhood, of how the coffee vendor down the street had the best burnt cinnamon rolls, of how my sister used to cry when the election results came in, of how we used to trap raccoons for one season just to see them argue about garbage. Tiny, ordinary things. Vada would smile and squeeze my hand even when it took all her strength. Her fingers were hot in mine. I would stroke the thinness of her hair and promise that by the time she was ready, the lab would be safe and the work would be hers again, if that was what she wanted. On the third day, Sterling showed up with a different kind of face. He had found a lawyer who talked big and rode slow. He had used his old contacts to call the funder and to whisper questions into ears that had not been properly briefed. He told anyone who would listen that we had committed fraud by rerouting money without notice. He threatened lawsuits and public campaigns. He tried to eat the hallways with his anger. But when administrators had the paperwork, copies, signatures, bank transfers, they could see the pattern. When the biosafety officer had the inventory and the chain of custody on missing items, they could see negligence. When Officer Bradshaw had the report of the van sold under false pretense, he could see theft. All of these things are not glamorous. They are slow and stubborn. They do not make great television. They make an argument that holds up under sworn testimony. Sterling's threats shrunk into a litany. He began to ask for mercy like a man asking for credit. He wanted access to his account. He wanted back his status.
He wanted to be let into the lab to fix things. He wanted not to be looked at like the man who had left someone on a ventilator. I had 1,000 reasons to be soft with him. He was, in a way, my son. I had given him a start. I had sent him cash when his pockets were empty, and I had believed him when he promised to be better. But mercy that protects the abusive doer
is a cruelty to the wounded person who must live inside the aftermath. When you keep giving to someone who takes, you are sometimes keeping them from the justice that might teach them to change. There is a terrible clarity that comes when you see someone you love at their worst, and you must decide what to do. That clarity is not joy. It is the removal of illusion. I decided that day that I would not let sentiment cover danger. I called and signed the form that would transfer oversight of the grant to a trustee, accountable to Veda's care. Odora filled in the paperwork like a calm surgeon. The trusteeship was not a death sentence. It was an interim measure to ensure that funds were used as intended, research, safety, and care, not to bankroll a man's appetite. Sterling called me a thief for that, and for the first time his voice trembled with something like real fear. He banged on the secure door in the hallway that would not open. He screamed that I had no right, and he spit a line that I will not scoop into scandal, but that whispered of the small cruelties men imagine into their power. He wanted something back. He wanted to be let in, because being outside meant losing the illusion of control. The locksmiths finished their work at dusk. The security team replaced the badges and posted a man at the entrance who looked like he meant it when he said, "Nobody in without clearance." The red light above the lab door kept blinking, patient and unjudging. The biosafety officer stayed late to log inventories. Odora left with shoulders that remained rigid until she was in her car. Then she took a breath and smiled the brittle smile of someone who had made a hard day better. I remembered the corridor after they left. The fluorescent lights were less stabbing. The custodians had swept. A cup of coffee sat cooling on a tray by the nurse's station. Veda's chart was tucked into the board with a clothespin. I sat for a moment and thought of the things I had given. Money, time, belief. I thought of the things I had taken away. Access, false security, the chance for someone to use money to do harm. I also thought about the future. This is not a tale that ends on headlines. It is a story about repair. We set up the fund, we compiled the inventory, we insisted on strict oversight. We did not take pleasure in watching a man lose his privileges. We took satisfaction only in the small arithmetic of safety. Secure doors, counted chemicals, therapy appointments kept. Sterling did not give up. The day he realized his badge no longer lit up, he was desperate enough to threaten me by name.
He said things that were meant to cut, meant to make me doubt the choice I had made. "You can't be both my mother and my judge," he said. Perhaps there is truth in that sentence, but there is also truth in another. You cannot keep someone alive by making them a prisoner of your appetite. He was trapped by his own making. The same hands that had handled the ledger had made debts he could not pay with charm. If you picture him in that corridor, hands on the glass, shouting, face flushed, you should also picture the rest of us, administrators who took slow, bureaucratic breathers, locksmiths who changed steel, nurses who kept Veda's bed, Odora who wrote petitions like felled trees, Officer Bradshaw who filled out the report with a hand that did not tremble. It was not a single heroic moment. It was many small, lawful acts that, together, built a wall between life and danger. The night before the audit was to be presented to the committee, a man from Federal Biosecurity called to say they were aware and that a representative would come by to assess the lab. That call felt like a bell. It meant that the issue had left our small circle and was moving into authorities whose job it is to take broken things and look at them under microscopes that are not metaphorical. Relief came with an institutional weight. It was comforting in a way that is difficult to explain. Not the comfort of vengeance, but the comfort of things being held by systems larger than any one bad man. We were careful, all of us. We never claimed Sterling had intentionally infected anyone. We never imagined that kind of demon. We alleged negligence and misuse. We documented missed safety checks and diverted funds that should have paid for replacements and training. We kept the narrative tethered to evidence. In part, we did this because we had no interest in becoming monsters ourselves. In part, we did this because when one person tampers with safety, other people die. A mother has a responsibility that is not sentimental. It is structural. The last image of that first week that follows me is Sterling standing against the corridor wall under the red light, his badge dark in his hand, his mouth moving without words that could be heard. He had been a man who took and cajoled. Now he was a man who had to face the investigation and the possibility of consequences he had never considered. He was thrown into a kind of isolation that was not theatrical. It was legal containment. But containment is not the end. It is the moment when the world decides to look. The lock is not a trap we set with malice. It is a safety mechanism engaged by people with the badges and the authority to do so. I did not teach anyone to weaponize a pathogen. I called professionals. I signed forms. I documented crimes. I did the ordinary things that people do when they are trying to keep a child alive. The corridor emptied and we all went home in pieces.
I drove through rain that night and felt like a woman who had survived a small war. I had been cruel in the only way that sometimes saves, decisive. I had stripped a man of his privileges because privileges are tools. Wielded wrongly, tools hurt. I had, at the same time, had to brace for the after. The work of rebuilding is long and laborious. People mistake the loud moments for the important ones. They are not. The important work is the long checking of lists, the small phone calls that make a recovery possible, the trust rebuilt in measured steps. As I write this from a chair that has the dent of many late nights, I know the next week will be filled with hearings and more phone calls and the low, regulated anxiety of waiting. There will be interviews and people who try to make his story simple and mine complicated. There will be the thin tide of public opinion we cannot manage. I do know this. When a person makes a practice of taking, at some point someone must make a practice of protecting. The difference between cruelty and justice is not always clean. Sometimes it is the difference between a badge and a prayer. Sometimes it is the difference between a bank ledger and a breathing chest. When the biosecurity team arrived the next morning, they came with a seriousness that reminded me of Dr. Dubois and his charts. They walked through the lab with clipboards and gloves, asking questions that were technical and, to my ears, ultimately merciful. They did not make a spectacle of Sterling. They asked for evidence, and we offered it. They sealed a room that contained a freezer, and they posted a notice that read, in bureaucratic prose, that the room was inaccessible pending examination. They did not tell me it was because of a virus in the way the tabloids would like to say. They said risk assessment and chain of custody and potential hazard. They said very plainly that if protocols had been bypassed, we could not risk anything. At lunchtime, Sterling found me in the hospital cafeteria. His eyes were red and raw. For a moment, his tough act cracked, and a boy I recognized, someone who had once sat at my kitchen table and spoken of things in the future like they were promises, peeked through. He said things now that he had not said before. Pleas, apologies, a kind of raw regret that felt both true and calculated. "Help me," he said. "You can help me." I looked at him and thought of the Van's keys in the mason jar and the notebook with the underlined line. I thought of the sound Veda made when the ventilator hissed and the nurse rearranged a tube. I thought of the trusteeship that would ensure money for her care, of Odora sitting with her legal pad like a general. Help is a problem when the one asking for it has been the source of harm. "I can help Veda," I said slowly. "You help yourself by answering for what you've done." He had no answer for that.
He had threats again, muttered about lawsuits and reputations, then a softer voice, about being lost, about not knowing how to stop. I know the shape of addiction to a pattern. I know how hard it is to be a man when the world will let you be a boy. I also know how damaging it is to continue to let someone run unchecked. When he left the cafeteria, the security guard at the door tapped his earpiece and said into it, "He's gone." The guard's voice was flat, and that was perhaps the kindest sound that day. They put up more signs that afternoon. Access disabled, do not enter. They changed codes. They filed notice with federal authorities. It wasn't glamour. It was a lot of forms and a lot of waiting. But waiting held a thing together that could have come apart. There was a moment before the committee met when I sat alone in my car with the engine off and the rain running in small streaks down the windshield. I thought of Vada's fingers on mine in the sterile light, and I thought of Sterling's threats. I thought of the line I kept turning in my head. You cannot keep someone alive by making them a prisoner of your appetite. There is a geometry to care that is precise. You cut the dangerous thing away if it will hurt the heart you are trying to save. The committee hearing opened the next morning. There were people with clipboards and expressions that meant they were already ready for the task. The biosafety officer presented the evidence. The funding agency listened. Sterling had a lawyer who was louder but less patient. He tried to call foul on the trusteeship, on the freeze, on the safekeeping of funds, but the audited ledger, the photocopy of the notebook, the nurse's notes, the van sale receipts, these were not the sort of things sound bites could erase. When the committee voted, they did so by the kind of somber majority that means a system has spoken. They affirmed the temporary trusteeship, they placed the lab under an extended safety review, and they recommended that the biosafety team work with federal assessors. Sterling stood at the back, his figure smaller than the day he'd first strode in. He looked like a man who had been stripped of the stage. The red light above the lab door remained blinking. The locksmiths had left a card in the doorframe. Security had taped a notice to the window. I walked past the lab, past the notices, and for a second I felt like a person who had done what she could. But the night was young, and there were people who wanted to find narrative advantage in pain. There were reporters and algorithms and the slow churn of rumor. There were decisions yet to be made about civil suits, about restitution, about how to keep a young woman alive and give her back not only health but some dignity. I left the campus with a sense of something held in place. It was not closure. It was an uneasy promise. The next days would bring more hearings, more calls, more waves of people wanting to know why and who to blame.
Sterling would try to claw back what he lost with legal teeth. He would have advocates and angry friends and a voice that sounded like grievance. But he would also have people who would stand with the ledger and the notebook and the nurse's notes. I drove through rain that evening, thinking about the work of undoing harm. It is not an act of fury. It is an act of careful, patient repair. I had not locked him inside with the virus, as some would later simplify. No one with any sense of decency would do such a thing. The lockdown was a procedural emergency enacted by authorities who knew how to weigh risk. The phrase made a good story, and people like stories. But the work we did was quieter. Proof, petition, trusteeship, and the slow, stubborn protection of a woman who could not yet stand with help. As I pulled into the driveway that night, my hands smelled faintly of antiseptic from the hospital. I put the car in park and sat a moment, thinking of the days to come. There is a line between being the judge and being the mother. I live on that line. It is a narrow, uncomfortable place. The choice to cut someone off is not free of regret. It is full of calculation and grief. But regret does not always mean wrong. The next morning, as storm clouds gathered again, the lab's security system sent an alert. Access attempts logged, a badge that shouldn't light up but did in a flurry at 9:12 a.m. The security feed caught Sterling at the back entrance, slamming his hands on the door. He had a look other people call pleading, but I had seen pleading before. What came next would test whether the institutional locks we had placed would hold not just doors, but also reality. The phone on my kitchen table buzzed with Odora's number. She did not sound surprised. She sounded like someone who had been waiting for that ping and had already planned out the next moves. "They're trying again," she said. "The federal team is on its way, but we need to make sure he stays out of the sensitive areas. Security can keep him from physical access, but we need to make sure nothing moves." "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "Come back," she said. "You should be there. They are still very much a risk to anyone left in that environment." I sighed. My bones were weary, but my feet moved. There is no comfort for the mother who waits when her child is in a hospital bed, and the threat is a man who thinks himself above rules. I called Dr. Dubois to check on Veda and told him I might be returning to campus. He said she had opened her eyes that morning, smiled, and clung to the nurse's hand like a small anchor. When I drove back, the lab's red light was like a heartbeat. The corridor smelled the same, cleaner now, but with that underlying hospital tang that keeps you alert. Sterling stood in the same place as yesterday, his hands in his pockets, his face a map of all he had not prepared for. The security guards were there, gloved and professional. The locksmiths were on call. The biosafety officer had a federal liaison on his phone. We all waited as people in suits and uniforms moved like chess pieces. When the federal team stepped in, they did not ask for my name. They asked for documentation. They read sterile phrases and made notes. They had a way of turning the possibility of danger into a list of mitigations. It was, in its own way, a moral act. Sterling tried one last time to push past the guards. He was told he was trespassing. He was told he would be escorted away if he did not respect the notice. He shouted. He tried to plead to Veda's room. He banged on the window as the red light blinked above his head. And then, slowly, as if a man was finally coming to terms with the shape of his consequences, he stopped. He turned and walked off the campus with his head down, like a man who had been given a map he had never studied. He turned and walked off the campus with his head down, like a man who had been given a map he had never studied. For a while, the sound of his steps swallowed whatever words he might have had left. The red light kept blinking. The locks held. The federal team sealed a freezer and took photographs, and asked the kind of questions that do not hurt because they are mean, but because they are thorough. After that first week, the noise around us settled into the particular grind of bureaucracy and healing. People imagine drama as a single bright flare. Healing is quieter.
It is filings and receipts. It is a nurse who calls you on a Sunday to remind you about an appointment. It is the lab director sending emails that say, in corporate blandness, "Please comply with the revised safety protocols." It is Odora sipping bad coffee in my kitchen at midnight, her binder open, translating acronyms into armor. Veda's recovery did not follow any storybook. There were good days, the kind where you see a real smile, and bad ones where she slept like a small animal and woke with the confusion that comes from being stitched back together by people with licenses. Dr. Dubois held the line between hope and caution like a steward at a harbor. He walked me through the phases: breathe easier, then breathe better, then build muscle, then talk again about work. He never promised miracles. He promised diligence. That promise felt like a towel around a wound. We set up the care fund the way Odora said we should: a restricted account, trustees named, clear disbursement rules for therapy, for physical rehab, for the educational support Veda would need if she wanted to return to her field. The fund was small at first, contributions from neighbors, a tiny grant from a sympathetic foundation, but it grew. Queen Candy helped in a way that surprised me. She organized a modest fundraiser at a coffee shop downtown and asked people to bring stories instead of money. She posted a picture, not the coy one that began the rumor mill, but a simple shot of Veda's sketchbook with a cup of tea beside it.
People sent in amounts and notes that read, "Keep going," and "We saw you." Sometimes the world is generous because it can be. Sometimes it is generous because someone asks plainly. There were formal hearings and there were less formal reckonings. The university's audit found irregularities in how funds had been categorized and confirmed missing inventory. The auditors did not frame it as a novel evil. They framed it as negligence, an absence of care where care was required. Odora pressed civil claims for restitution and misappropriation. Officer Bradshaw's reports went to a local prosecutor's office that weighed criminal charges against administrative action. I will not pretend the legal system moves like a sinew. It moves like a patient machine. It grinds faults into judgments and sometimes leaves behind less than you hope. Still, in that slow mechanics, there was justice of a kind. Institutions recognizing their duty to protect, paperwork becoming a way to write a ledger that had been allowed to tilt. Sterling's lawyer tried to make the moral ledger bend back. They painted him as a talented young man who had simply made mistakes. They argued for rehabilitation rather than ruin. There is a time and place for that argument. It is not, I decided then, the time to ask the victim to run that lecture. Veda did not need a sermon. She needed stability and health, and one day a chance to decide on her own terms whether she wanted to work in research again. The trusteeship that Odora had negotiated held. Funds were redirected to cover medical bills and to pay for retraining options. The van's proceeds, what little of them remained after the hurried sale and the paperwork, were applied to the fund as part of a settlement. It was not dramatic. It was math with conscience. It was enough to patch one small hole. Sterling, in the months after, became an object of a public kind of shame that is both forgiving and pitiless. He had friends who still called and asked how he was. He had admirers who sent indignant messages about institutions being too quick to judge. He had enemies who told the story in a tone that made him a villain to be entertained. He spent money on lawyers and had nights when he sat where I had once sat, hands empty, breath loud, thinking of what he had been offered and squandered. I do not take pleasure in watching someone falter. I take satisfaction in the math of safety adding up. There was a hearing where the university declined to renew his postdoctoral appointment. They cited breach of safety protocol and misappropriation. The decision made some people uneasy. It made others exhale the way people do when a small disaster is finally named. Sterling's life narrowed. He lost access privileges, badges that would not light up, accounts that were frozen. At one point, he showed up at a temp agency and applied for day labor. He smiled like a man learning a new grammar. I saw him once from across a street. He was carrying a low bucket and wearing paint-splashed jeans. He looked smaller but present. It did not thrill me. It did not make my chest sing. It made me breathe differently, as if the world had found a way for him to be placed somewhere he could not hurt people with access. Meanwhile, Vada made small claims on life that felt enormous. She sat through a physical therapy session where someone named her strength and told her she would have balance again. She walked from bed to bathroom, then down a short hall, then twice around the hospital floor. She began to talk about the future in thin, hopeful sentences. If the committee will let me, I'd like to come back, she said once, voice like a leaf.
I wanted to say yes and then wrap her in a blanket and refuse the world. Instead, I said what was true. We'll make it safe. We'll make it on terms you choose. We drew up a plan with the postdoctoral program director, a protective oversight arrangement, mentoring support separate from the lab in question, a partial return with strict safety checklists, and an independent auditor reporting to the trustees. It was not a triumph. It was a measured, bureaucratic kindness. Safety is a kind of circumference you build slowly. I watched Vada meet the people who would work with her, and found in their faces a kind of permission for her to exist again. Odora, who had become a fixture on our living room couch and in the back pew of our church, wore the weeks like armor. She had small rituals, a folder for receipts, a coffee thermos with a dent, a toothbrush she kept in her purse, because sometimes hearings ran long. She would look at me across a table and say, patiently, "You did well." I knew what she meant. She meant I had turned generosity into action. She meant I had refused to be reduced to the role of a soft woman whose kindness was a doormat. At some point, Sterling tried to reach Vada directly, a move that made the nurse who caught the voicemail call me with a careful voice. He left messages that were alternately pleading and furious. He asked to meet. He wanted closure, he said. He claimed repentance. He said he could not understand what he had done until he had to live without the lab at his feet. The nurse, by procedure and by sense, refused to forward the calls. I heard one of the messages because she transcribed it. I didn't mean, "I'll pay. I'll do anything, just let me talk." The plea had the shape of someone practicing humility as another way to get what they want. I remembered the nights I had sat with him at my kitchen table, the way his hands had eaten the air when he described these fanciful plans for a future he did not earn. There were many ways to be kind. Protecting Vada was one of them. I put my phone on silent and did not respond. I signed the papers that would keep his contact restricted for the sake of a patient still rebuilding trust.
There were smaller, kinder scenes that held me more tightly than any courtroom. A group of graduate students, some who had been hurt, some who had just wanted to do clean work, brought a binder to the nurse's station filled with notes about lab safety, with offers to volunteer time for oversight, with messages to Veda that read like small flags, "We're with you." A retired lab technician who had worked under the fluorescent for decades sent Veda a box of pens and a note that said, "Make something new with these." The community did not always move grandly. It moved in quiet hands, folding boxes and typing emails and bringing casseroles. One afternoon, months in, I drove to see Sterling where he was living in a room above a laundromat. He had a job at a supplier's warehouse shelving boxes. It was practical work. It was honest work. He was thinner, and his hands bore a clerk's callus. He opened the door to my knock as if he'd been expecting the weather to change. He stood in the doorway, and the smell of detergent and cold air met me. There was a way to be more cruel in that scene than Odora's paperwork had been. I could have screamed everything I'd held back. I could have turned a private wound into a public spectacle. But I had already learned that spectacle does not rebuild life. He asked me, without the bravado, how Veda was. I told him she was getting better, and that she had agreed to a return plan under supervision. He tried to find a phrase that would make him less monstrous. He reached for one of the old excuses. I was under pressure. But his mouth could not make it a full truth. For a long time he simply stood there and looked like a man made of separate things. He wanted something from me that I could no longer give, a clearing of the debt without accounting for its cost. "I can't help you like I used to," I said. "I won't hand you keys that belong to other people's lives." He looked down, then up, and something like shame touched him. He said, "I know." He put his hands in his hands, and when he lifted it again, his eyes had red lines like the channeling of a storm. "I need to do better," he said, and it felt honest and small. "I don't know how." That perhaps is the most honest thing we can ask of a person who is harmed. Not that they be granted return immediately, but that they prove they have learned to live by a different account. It is not for me to make the ledger vanish. It was for me to insist the ledger be true. Time does a slow thing to pain. It does not erase it. It dims it to a distance that allows other things, work, community, small pleasures, to occupy space. Veda, after a long season of therapy and rest, began to teach again, not in the exact same lab, not at first, but in a community lab that had put together a safety program and a mentoring team. Her hands, once thin and tentative, grew stronger. She brought me a painting she had made in an art therapy session, a messy, vibrant thing with a line of green that looked like a path. She laughed when she gave it to me and said, "I tried to paint the van, but it came out like a comet." I laughed too, and then we cried a little because of how small and enormous the recovery felt. There came a final administrative meeting where the university laid out the terms of the settlement. Sterling agreed, reluctantly, to restitution and to community service hours that included speaking about lab safety at junior orientations.
It was a humiliating arrangement for a man who had once believed influence would substitute for honesty. He stood in front of a group of undergraduates and said, voice tight, that protocols matter. He did not talk about his personal failures in detail. He did not have to. The young faces in the auditorium listened as if the lesson had weight. I wondered quietly whether shame could be turned into pedagogy and whether humility could be taught with the same vigor as technique. The community, in the end, became the jury I trusted most. Not a jury of condemnation, but one of repair. The coffee shop where Candy had raised money started a small scholarship in Veda's name for young women entering science from underfunded backgrounds. A retired professor donated hours to mentor members of the community lab. A neighbor showed up at my door with a warm pie on a day when there were more phone calls than sleep. These are not the band concerts of triumph. They are the daily instruments of life. There were moments, inevitably, when the world simplified what had happened into a headline. Someone wrote a headline that leaned into the literal reading of the phrase people loved. She locked him in the lab with the virus. I saw that headline once and felt fatigue like an ache. The headline told a story that sparkled at the edges, but that did not bear the weight of what we had done. We did not trap a man in a room to be consumed by his own creation. We called the people trained to evaluate risk. We documented the ledger. We moved funds to care. We shut off access to a place that had become unsafe. The crunch of the locks was not vengeance. It was procedure. Sometimes people ask me, privately, whether I regret being so hard. They imagine an easier, softer path where hugs and counseling fix theft and ruin. I have a long life that tells me otherwise. There were evenings I lay awake thinking about the times I'd given, and when that given had meant encouraging a pattern that would eat someone small. Regret sits with me like an old cat. It is warm and inconvenient. But I do not regret the day I turned my attention from being generous to being a steward of safety. There is a difference between cruelty and decisive care, and I have tried to live on the side of life. Months on, I found myself watching Sterling from a distance once. No need for confrontation or reconciliation.
He was working at a hardware store, stacking boxes and talking politely to customers. He looked less like the breed of man who believed the world owed him everything. He looked like a person who might, in time, turn his hands to usefulness rather than harm. I do not imagine absolution as a simple bell you ring. It is a slow emergence that must be earned. One evening, as the light leaned toward gold and the city seemed to breathe easier, I drove past the lab. The red light was gone. The door bore a small plaque that described the lab's newly established safety committee. Veda had not returned yet in full-time capacity, but she had been in, under supervision, and had sat across from the new safety officer, making suggestions from the vantage of someone who had almost been hurt and found the courage to speak. There is a different kind of power in that, the power to change the walls that almost broke you. I will not pretend the story wraps like a bow. There is ongoing therapy and audits and a civil settlement that will take years to finalize. There are nights I still wake with the smell of lemon cleaner in my nostrils, the beeps of monitors echoing like lessons. There are mornings I read an article that tucks my experience into a tendon of outrage and calls it entertainment. But there are also mornings when Veda calls to tell me about a plant she has grown in her window, a little victory she is keen to protect. Those are the mornings I keep. If you ask me whether what I did, that steady slope from charity to guardianship, was cruelty or mercy, I will say this. Protection is an awkward form of love. It is the choice to put a fence when the cliff is near. It is refusing to fund a habit that will burn the house down. It is paperwork and patience, not spectacle. There are times the law must act. There are times the community must step in. There are times a mother must become an advocate who knows when kindness becomes enabling. I do not enjoy the shape of Sterling's fall. I do not celebrate his smallness. My satisfaction is confined to the arithmetic of safety. Veda breathing, funds in a trusteeship, the lab under new protocols, a man learning to live within limits. The lock I helped set in motion was not a fantasy of dramatic isolation. It was a legal, institutional response designed to keep people safe while the truth was established. People will write their versions. People will trim corners to fit their appetites for drama. The real story sits in the pages of deposition transcripts and in therapy notes, and in the way a community hands over casseroles without asking for publicity. Sometimes at night, when the city is softer, I think about the line I once said aloud. You cannot keep someone alive by making them a prisoner of your appetite. The line holds. It is not a moral cliff. It is a working rule I use to weigh each decision. You love, you provide, but you do not permit someone to use that love as collateral for their addictions.
Months later, at a small hearing that was more form than theater,
Sterling signed a document acknowledging some responsibility and agreeing to certain reparative measures. It was not a moment of dramatic confession. It was paper and initials, and a man touching a pen as if it were an instrument from which he could perhaps coax a different life. He left the courthouse like many do. No applause, no tears, simply the small, ordinary walk to the street. I drove him home that day, not because I wished to open the door to all his needs, but because Odora advised the move as a way to keep things calm during a fragile moment. He sat across from me in the passenger seat, hands folded, eyes flat with a fatigue that has neither simplicity nor poetry. He said quietly, "I keep thinking of Vada." "Good," I said. "Keep thinking of her. It's the only place to start changing." He asked me almost shyly whether I would ever forgive him. I told him forgiveness is not a single coin you spend and forget. It is something you decide to work toward when the other person takes the steps that show they mean it. That sounded like an old woman's answer, and perhaps it was. Perhaps the best answers are the oldest. When the day came that Vada walked into the community lab on her own, carrying a small box of tools she liked, I was there with the sketchbook she had given me. She smiled at me like someone who had reclaimed an instrument. We did not have fireworks. We had a Yule of small things, a nod from the safety officer, a quiet clap from a colleague, a steadying breath. It was enough. I will close with a truth I have sat with. Fury can do a quick thing. Law can do a long thing. I chose the long thing because quick righteousness often leaves bodies unattended. If headlines want to say I locked him in a lab with a virus, let them. The real story is more complicated and quieter and, I think, more useful. He was placed into legal containment and institutional oversight. Professionals assessed hazards. Funds were redirected to cover care. And a woman who had been hurt was given a chance, fragile and slow, to be whole again. You can decide whether the measures were harsh or necessary. I know this. I would rather be remembered for making calculations that kept someone breathing than for a dramatic anger that left a body in ruin. This was not vengeance. It was an eviction of danger. If this story touches you, tell me where you're watching from, what city or state, and if you feel moved, share this with someone who needs to hear that protection can look like paperwork and patience. Thank you for listening.